Order, order. Mrs. Pauline Latham to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Walker, and what a delight it is to serve under your chairmanship today, and it's even better that the Minister has managed to make it, having been very busy in the chamber up until this point. Now, the motion is that this House has considered the Ukrainian Holodomor, and I hope that the people here today will actually consider slightly wider than that, and that this House is aware of the panorama of horror of the Ukrainian Holodomor and recognises that this man-made famine was a genocide. Now, I recognise that because everybody's on a one-line whip and we're about to go to a recess, a short recess, that there will not be many people speaking in today's debate, but it doesn't mean that it is not an issue of great historical, social and political significance. Now, in 2013, I spoke in this chamber about the Ukrainian Holodomor, and since then I've repeatedly called on the UK government to recognise the Holodomor in Ukraine as genocide. So I stand here today to remind colleagues of this atrocity, which occurred in the Ukraine from 1932 to 1933, and ask again that the government recognises the politicised act of evil as genocide. Holodomor literally means death by starvation, and the Ukrainian Holodomor was a campaign purposely orchestrated by Joseph Stalin to decimate the large segment of the Ukrainian population, the peasants, and the Soviet government tried to requisition as much food out of Ukraine as possible at that time. And it's broadly understood that the genocide actually began in 1929 with mass deportations of prosperous farmers and the execution of Ukrainian religious, academic and cultural leaders. In the 1930s, Stalin's food programme called for peasants to give up their land and join collective farms. Stalin was particularly opposed to the Ukrainian kulaks, who were slightly more prosperous and therefore thought to be more dangerous than poor peasants. Kulaks were turned out of their homes, forced to give up their own land and sent to labour camps. And it's clear that Stalin's regime wanted to teach Ukraine's farmers a lesson they would not forget for resisting the collectivisation. Soviet authorities set unachievable goals for Ukraine's basic grain production of 44% in 1932. This was exceedingly high, and achieving this was made even more difficult, given that the communists had already ruined the nation's productivity by eliminating their best farmers. In 1932, not a single village was able to meet the impossible quota, and under Soviet rule, no grain could be given to a peasant until the quota was achieved. Men, women and children, and we mustn't forget that they are farmers, fathers, mothers, daughters and sons, who were slowly starved to death through the implementation of a policy intended to put an end to the Ukrainian aspiration for independence. Stalin believed that the Ukrainian ethno-cultural self-assertion was a threat to the preeminence of Russian culture in Soviet affairs and to the centralisation of all political authority. Ukrainian peasants had their basic freedoms stripped away. They were banned from leaving their hometowns and villages. There was no escape. The ways to rescue were intentionally blocked. The Soviet troops detained hundreds of thousands of farmers, 90% of which were forcibly returned back to their hungry villages to die. Although the exact number of those who died during the Holodomor is not known, it's estimated to be between 7 and 10 million Ukrainian people. At the very height of the famine, 17 people died each minute. 1,041 people died each hour, and 25,000 people died each day. More than 3 million children were born in 33. They died of starvation. Many people died of starvation in their homes, with some of them trying to put an end to the process by suicide if they had the strength to do so. Whilst this was happening, the Soviet government injected 1.7 million tonnes of grain into Western markets. This grain, which could have saved millions of lives, was processed into vodka. Yes, of course I will.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I congratulate the Honourable Lady on bringing this forward. And I have to say, it's a part of history. While I might have had a small knowledge of it, I didn't know this entirely. I thank the Honourable Lady for bringing it forward. Would the Honourable Lady agree that the Ukrainian Holodomor stands as a reminder to the entire world that a nation can rise up from the ashes of hatred and take their rightful place, in which you join me in applauding the Ukrainian people and for the indomitable spirit that remains within them to this day?
Yeah. I thank the honourable gentleman for that intervention. There are hundreds of thousands of people in this country who are descendants from those people who were part and died through the Holodomor. So they have got an indomitable spirit, and they show it even now in Ukraine that they will not be bowed by the people of the Soviet Union. Thank you. The historian Dominic Sambrook recently wrote in the Daily Mail of the brutality of this Marxist experiment. He said that there were starving children, mass graves, vigilantes, even cannibalism. The famine saw human nature stripped to the bone. The disregard for the life of the Ukrainian people was abominable. The corpses of those who died seeking food laid on the roadside. In the winter, many of the bodies were concealed by snow until the spring thaw, at which point they were callously dumped into mass graves by communists. A third of all the Ukrainian villages was put on the blacklist. These villages were turned into ghettos of famine. There was no chance to survive. People started to eat corpses. At the peak of the crisis in 1933, policemen barged into their farmhouses and seized everything that could be eaten. Not just grain, but potatoes, squash, peas, everything in their cupboards. So I believe it's our duty to not only raise awareness of this historic atrocity, but acknowledge this event as what it was, genocide. The dictionary describes a genocide as the deliberate killing of a large group of people, especially those of a particular nation or ethnic group. As I've already stated, the Ukrainian Holodomor saw the systematic starvation of a huge proportion of the Ukrainian nation, particularly of the peasant class, as a consequence of Stalin's dogma. In the same way that the Holocaust is an example of genocide perpetrated by an overtly racist, fascist regime, which had as its avowed purpose the annihilation of the Jewish people, the Ukrainian Holodomor is an example of the crime deliberately perpetrated by a communist regime contaminated by Russian chauvinism targeting one nation of people. As was acknowledged by the government in response to my 2013 debate, the fact that during the famine, Stalin closed the eastern border of Ukraine to stop starving peasants entering Russia in search of food is perhaps one of the strongest indications that his policies were at least in part motivated by hostility to Ukraine as a nation with an identity, tradition and culture of its own. Today, this will be called ethnic cleansing. Members may also be interested to learn that Dr. Raphael Lemkin, the author of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948, called the destruction of the Ukrainian nation a classic example of genocide. He noted that the intention of the Holodomor was to eliminate Ukrainian nationalism and tackle the Ukrainian national resistance, and in an attempt to achieve this, the peasantry was sacrificed. I note that in the debate I held on this topic in 2013, my right honourable friend David Lidington MP, then the Minister for Europe, argued that since the UN Genocide Convention was enacted in 1948, the Holodomor could not be legally defined as a genocide retrospectively. He argued that it was necessary for judges rather than governments to make such a designation of genocide, since the courts are better placed to make decisions on essentially criminal matters. However, if this remains the case, I would ask the Minister to give consideration to the following questions. What needs to happen for the UK judiciary to consider the question of the Holodomor as a genocide? Has there been a UK legal precedent that could be used by a potential prosecuting body as a legal route map? Which of all the UK courts, from the Supreme Court right down to the Magistrates' Court, is most competent and best placed to evaluate the Holodomor question? And would the government consider initiating an inquiry or judicial process? It's important that we acknowledge that 17 other nations have already recognised the Holodomor in Ukraine as genocide, including Australia, Canada and the US. And I note that the Australian Senate recognised it as genocide in 2003, and the European Parliament identified the Holodomor as a crime against humanity in 2008. I believe that it's only right that the UK follow suit, and I fail to understand why we don't. It's interesting to learn that sociological research shows that 80% of Ukrainians consider the Holodomor as an act of genocide. In 2006, the government of Ukraine passed a law recognising the disaster as genocide against the Ukrainian people. In the vote in the Ukrainian parliament, pro-Western parties voted in favour of the law. Ukraine has sought international recognition of Holodomor as an act of genocide and says that Russia should accept responsibility for the famine as the legal successor of the Soviet Union. Russia says that it cannot be classified as a genocide as millions of people from various ethnic backgrounds across the Soviet Union suffered. So members may ask the significance of raising the issue today, 85 years after the event. Well, there are a number of reasons for this. It should be stressed that this is not simply a Ukrainian issue. This event had universal implications across the globe. The Ukrainian Holodomor is an example of crime caused by a political ideology and fuelled by prejudice. It's a tragic and extreme example of the impacts of a dictatorship and the dangers posed by a regime which removes freedoms from individuals under its rule. There are important lessons which can be learnt from this event, and ensuring that the world is never again blind to such a wide-scale atrocity. Since 1932, using starvation to control people has become standard amongst communist regimes. We've seen it in China, North Korea, Ethiopia, Cambodia and Zimbabwe. We need to send the strongest possible signal that it can never happen again. Furthermore, it must be understood that memories of the famine underlie much of the current tension between Russia and Ukraine. Our understanding of this issue is central to our grasp of current affairs. Subsequently, it should be noticed that the questioning of Ukraine's right to exist as an independent nation, as well as the continued denial of the Holodomor by the Russian officials, are troubling and dangerous developments, not only for Ukrainians, but for all of us in this chamber here today and across the world who love and value our liberties. In Ukraine today, it's noted that their current political and social troubles arise from boundless fear as a consequence of the Holodomor. They fear reverting back to their national roots because there were times when being linked to these roots caused the death of millions of people. However, they also look at events very positively. In Ukrainian President's speech in 2015, he said the Ukrainians must remember their past and draw conclusions from it. They're keen to get rid of the nation victim sentiment and be proud that they defended their place on the European political map when up against great adversity. I believe it's vital that we commemorate those whose lives were stolen. We must remember their lives and reflect upon the tragic way in which they were taken. I'm sure that members here today will appreciate that the Holodomor is a never-ending trauma for the Ukraine. The event had a catastrophic impact on their national identity. Every year, Ukrainians mark a Holodomor Remembrance Day on the fourth Saturday of November. This year, that will fall on Saturday, the 25th of November, so it is appropriate that we discuss this at this time of year. It's our duty to the millions of victims of the Holodomor to remember them and to make their stories known throughout the world as one of the most tragic pages in mankind's history in the 20th century. It should also be noted that today there are still those who deny the famine happened. For example, in Russia, it's illegal to commemorate the Holodomor. By commemorating the events, we are taking a stand against this unjust stance. The Ukrainians hope to establish a comprehensive social dialogue of memory at the same time as moving on and developing as a fully free and democratic nation. In 1991, the very first memorial book was published following Ukraine gaining independence, after 60 years of taboo imposed by Soviet unions on this tragic subject. The family of Ukrainian journalists Lydia Kovalenko and Volodymyr Maniak collected and arranged testimonies from all over Ukraine. According to the authors of the book, the survivors had reached their final stages in life, and they hastened to tell the terrible truth that had haunted them all their lives. The totalitarian regime tried to trample down the very memory of the terrible famine into the ground. There are still graves in yards and gardens in some villages even today. The living had no strength to take the dead to the cemetery, burying where they lived and died. As we are sadly aware, the 20th century was a time of great human tragedies. Whilst the majority of British people know about tragedies such as the Holocaust of 39-45, few British had heard about the horrors of the Holodomor. Until recent years, there was minimal world awareness. The crimes of Bolshevism and Stalinism are identical to those of Nazism. The very natures of these regimes is one and the same. In the Soviet Union, the Holodomor was a taboo subject which was denied and covered up. In addition, Soviet authorities attacked Western journalists who wanted to inform the public about the real scope of famine. It's hard for us today to believe that a large international power could keep an atrocity of this size secret for decades. Thus, the Holodomor nearly disappeared from world awareness. In connection to the raising of awareness, I support hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians in the UK and millions all over the world calling on this government to include the Holodomor in the curriculum on British schools. And I recently wrote a letter to the Education Secretary, the Right Honourable Justin Greening, to this effect. I've yet to have a response. Close to my constituency of Mid-Derbyshire, there's a national Ukrainian campsite that's been running for many years and enables descendants of families who were caught up in the Holodomor to come together to ensure their original roots and culture live on. And I have the privilege of visiting the centre most summers, and the children come from across the country to participate. And it's interesting that many of the people who have gone every year as children, quite a few of them end up marrying and actually getting married in the church there, which is a rather nice end to their relationships and their childhood. But many people are volunteers who go year on year to try to remember what it was like for their forebears, but also to keep the Ukrainian community together. And I've built up a relationship with many of the young people and the organisers over the past 10 years or so, which is why I'm concerned that this part of history isn't being taught in schools. And I know that it would mean a great deal to them if their ancestors' stories were told and more people had a greater awareness of the horrors of the Holodomor. So to summarise today, I appeal to our government to finally give the Ukrainian Holodomor its rightful status as a genocide, just as many other countries have done before us. Stalin's weaponisation of hunger in the Ukraine highlights the true evil of his communist regime and the impact which it had on people who were quashed beneath it. We must highlight this historical wrongdoing and raise awareness. By taking this affirmative action and showing our solidarity with the people of Ukraine for whom this act of evil has had an intergenerational impact. Moreover, it is our duty to the millions of victims of the Holodomor and their ancestors to remember them and to make their story known to the world as one of the most tragic pages of the 20th century history. So I will conclude today by reading the words of one Holodomor survivor, which the Ukrainian president cited in a speech commemorating the Holodomor in 2015. Children do not run, they do not play but sit on the roads. Their feet are so skinny, drawn up, and a big belly between them. The head is large and bowed face to the ground, and there is almost no face, only teeth on top. A child is sitting and swinging all over, an infant moaning song, and it demands neither from the mother nor father, pleading into the empty space in the world, only one thing: eat, eat, eat. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered the Ukrainian Holodomor. Mr Stephen Pound.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Walker. It is, of course, an honour and a pleasure to serve under you. Mr Walker, it is a common courtesy on these occasions to pay credit to the member who is bringing the business before us. On this occasion, I would like to emphasise and underline that as more than just a courtesy. I think the Honourable Lady for Mid Derbyshire has done a great service to this House, not just today, but on the occasions in which she has spoken on this painful, agonising subject in the past. And she's absolutely right. As we approach the 25th of November, it is entirely appropriate that we do speak of these subjects. She, early on, Mr Walker, referred to the fact that there may not be a huge number of members here. However, believe you me, Mr Walker, this is an issue that resonates throughout the world. We are very fortunate to have Natalia Galibarenko, the ambassador of the Republic of Ukraine, present, and she is here because this matters to Ukrainians today. This matters to people, and not just to people from Ukraine, but to people who love humanity, who love decency, and who want to actually correct and at least recognise some of the horrors of the past. Mr Walker, may I apologise for the absence of the Right Honourable Gentleman from Malden, who is the chair of the APPG on Ukraine. He's been summoned to Brussels to meet Monsieur Michel Barnier, and I think it would have been a difficult choice for him to have decided whether to go there or to stay here. But as a stalwart friend of Ukraine, he would wanted to have been here, and he would want to join me in paying tribute and credit to the Honourable Lady. Mr Walker, famine comes in many guises. We have the Bengal famine, we have the Irish famine, we have the Highland clearances. But when Lemkin in 1943 spoke of genocide, he referred to two specific incidences. He referred to the Holodomor and he referred to the Armenian genocide, of it's commemorated usually in April, 100 years. In fact, it was April 1915. These two genocides, and I think the Honourable Lady is absolutely right to use that word, are specifically terrible, each in their own special way. Let us just try to define our terms about Holodomor. Firstly, she quite rightly said that there was some confusion as to the exact number of people. There was a court of appeal in Kiev in the year 2000 when they figured that the actual number was nearer 10 million, particularly if Kuban is involved, because Kuban is a Ukrainian district, in fact, a region. It's bigger than an oblast. It's a very large region. If you include that, you're talking about 10 million people. Mr Walker, sometimes we have to actually pause and think of the significance of those numbers. 10 million people. We have to ask ourselves why it happened. It wasn't because of a failure of the grain crop. Ukraine was and is and has been the breadbasket of Europe. It has been the greatest supplier, the greatest producer of high-quality grain and bread throughout the centuries. Hitler always said that his main point in invading East was to actually seize that breadbasket to get the waving fields of corn, the grain of Ukraine. It must be, and I would say this, and this is, I don't hope it is not controversial anymore, the impact of collectivization. The kulaks, as the Honourable Lady has quite rightly said, were perceived as enemies of the state by Joseph Stalin. The collectivization resulted in nothing quite as serious as Ukraine, but in 4 other provinces, such as Uzbekistan, where they had similar crises in the 1930s. And anyone who's read Quiet Flows the Don by Mikhail Sholokhov will know that when collectivization was forced on villages, the commissars would come round every few months to actually see what was happening about that. And the problem is, as Sholokhov says so brutally on that particular story, which is known to all of us, when he inspects the horses in the village and he speaks to the groom, and he said, is everything going well, comrade? And he said, I fear not, comrade commissar, because every day I have to water the horses, I have to brush the horses, I have to feed the horses, and every day one horse gets more food, more water, and better attention, because that was my horse. And I can no longer lose those bonds that I had with that one horse. The commissar shoots him. And that was the extent at which human nature was trying to be forced against the grain in Ukraine, and where a most successful people were suffering in this brutal way. I would say, Mr. Walker, and I hope it's not controversial, this was, by any definition, a man-made famine and a genocide. And it wasn't just the individual spirit and courage of the Ukrainian people, which we've seen over and over again. Anyone who's in the Euromaidan, anyone who has actually seen the heroic reaction of Ukrainian people to the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Donetsk and the Donbass region will actually recognize the immense courage, the strength of the Ukrainian people. And that was a threat to the Comintern. That was a threat to the Communist Party in the 1930s. But there was also another aspect. That was the brutal anti-clericism, the actual attack on organized religion. One of the actors within the Holodomor was Yemelian Yaroslavsky, who ran an organization called the League of the Militant Godless. And it is something that Stalin could never quite come to terms with, how Ukrainian people clung to their faith. Whether it was Catholic in the West or whether it was Orthodox in most of the country, they clung to their faith. Stalin couldn't cope with that, and although later on he moderated his anti-clericalism, his brutality, his slaughter of the bishops, and after he came into some accommodation with the Patriarch in the late 30s, there was a distinct anti-clerical aspect to the slaughter within Ukraine. Ukraine was considered to be an awkward place. The word Ukraine, as we all know in the old Russian, means the borderland. And it was perceived as the borderland between Europe and Russia. Of course, Ukraine is far greater than a borderland. Ukraine is a nation in its own. It has its own language, its own culture, its own poetry, its own music, and it has its own football teams. It's a great nation. It's more than a borderland. But that was how the Russians saw it. And they wanted to keep that border safe and sanitized. It meant crushing the religion. It meant crushing the people. It meant crushing the nation. But, Mr. Walker, it didn't work. It absolutely did not work. I, for 20 years, have chaired an organisation called St. Michael Mission, which is committed to rebuilding churches, mostly in the, mostly in around Kiev, the Kiev Oblats, particularly in Fastiv and Lvov, where we have rebuilt a number of churches. And to our amazement, we discovered even through those equivalent of penal times, and at the moment in this country, we're looking back onto the horrors of 1606 and the gunpowder plot, and we know what penal times are like. Believe you me, it was pretty awful in Ukraine in that time, and yet faith survived. The churches were still there. There were still priests. There still was thriving religion, and it is my duty, and I'm proud and delighted to be able to say that we're continuing to actually work with those people in those churches and to re-establish certainly the churches in Western Ukraine. And also like to thank my colleague Margosha Zhatankovskaya, who has worked with me for many, many years, who represents the finest spirit and emotion there. But, Mr. Walker, with your permission, with your indulgence, I would like to actually talk about the wider issue of genocide and return to the Armenian genocide, which I mentioned earlier on. It was unfortunate on the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide in April 2015. We were distracted by a general election, and we couldn't mention it on the floor of the House. But I've had many, many debates about the Armenian genocide on the floor of the House, and I sympathise with the Honourable Lady. I reach across the chamber to clasp her and say, I too have suffered from miserable, pettifogging, bureaucratic ministers who are incapable of actually opening their hearts and recognising the full horror. In my case, it was a man called Hoon, Geoffrey Hoon, who said that there can be no such thing as genocide before 1943. Well, people died of cancer before anybody called it cancer, and it didn't make them any less painful at dying. This was genocide because, as Lemkin quite rightly referred to it, and as was adopted, as we know, by the United Nations on December the 9th, 1948, genocide is race murder. The word Holodomor, of course, we know in Ukrainian, means more likely famine genocide, so it is specific, but it is still genocide. Now, in the question of Armenia, 1.5 million people were systematically slaughtered, murdered, and driven into the desert to die by the Ottoman Empire agents at the particular time, particularly the leaders of that particular area in Aleppo and all the way along the Anatolian coast. This was another genocide. And when Lemkin referred to these two, he made that famous statement that refers to Hitler's speech, if you remember, who now remembers the Armenians? The Armenians were slaughtered. You could say the same about the Ukrainians, because isn't it extraordinary, Mr. Walker? When we talk about genocide and we talk about famine, until very recently we didn't talk about the Holodomor. We didn't talk about Ukraine, because in this country we didn't understand it. We didn't appreciate the full horror of it. And it is so much to the credit of people like the Honourable Lady from Mid Derbyshire that we are finally being able to confront this. And I join her enthusiastically, vehemently, powerfully, and as strongly as I can, as long as my colleague on the front bench will agree with me, in urging and pressing the government to accept once and for all the definition of genocide as applies to Holodomor. To have your nation slaughtered, to be part of a nation that is the victim of genocide, is a terrible thing. But to have that unrecognised by the word that all of us would understand as applying to it, that is even worse. The Honourable Gentleman, the Minister, has had the busiest of days. He's been going from Israel to Yemen to Ukraine, I mean, not physically, obviously, but in terms of his front-bench duties this afternoon. And he was probably exhausted by the number of people this afternoon on the floor of the House who said he's a great, good and decent man. I would not resile from that. I would not resile from that. He's a good man, and I hope that doesn't curse his political ambitions. However, I would urge him today to maybe, although he is flanked by some of the finest brains in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and he has the great weight of intellect behind him, to actually say, look, let's not be pettifogging about this anymore. Let's not complain about the exact etymology of the expression. Let's not complain about the chronology. Let's not actually do anything other than say, what happened in Ukraine, what happened in the Holodomor was genocide. Nothing more, nothing less. It was a specific, targeted genocide which destroyed the best of a generation. It never destroyed the Ukrainian people. It never destroyed that pride and courage and strength of the Ukrainian people. It never did that. But it took a generation, and it left a scar, which today you will still see people suffering from, feeling the pain for it. You cannot visit Ukraine today at any time without knowing that this is still a live wound. This is still a bruise. This is still a source of pain. It's not going to bring anybody back if we recognise the proper description of the Holodomor as genocide. But it might make people feel a little bit more assured that the rest of the world feels the pain that their ancestors and their families suffered. It may make them feel that they are slightly more vindicated in what they know. Because we can argue about the origins, we can argue about Stalin, we can throw stones at the communists, we can do whatever we want. But at the end of the day, nearly 10 million Ukrainian people died in the most abject agony. The Honourable Lady has quite rightly read that phrase, that paragraph that we all know so well. We've seen the photographs. We know what it was like, but we cannot feel what it was like. We know through the prism of history. We know through the pages of our textbooks, we know through the screens of our computers, but we cannot know what it was like for those people whose grandparents, whose great-grandparents starved to death, who maybe did resort to cannibalism. God forbid they did, but in moments of desperation, people do desperate things. Is it too much to ask that today we say the Ukrainian people has suffered long, the Ukrainian people has suffered hard? What we will do today is to accept and acknowledge that suffering. We will give it the proper title, the proper name, genocide. Thank you.
Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. There can be nothing more harrowing than for parents watching their children die in front of them slowly and over many weeks and months. And I congratulate the Honourable Member for Mid Derbyshire for bringing forward this debate today and for the work she has done in this area. The picture she painted is one of horror, of brutality, of oppression. And I think she's absolutely right to call on the government now to recognise the Holodomor as genocide. We've heard that between 7 and 10 million people died. The Honourable Member for Ealing, Ealing North, said that it's recognised now that it's closer to 10 than 7. But she also pointed out that this wasn't over simply 2 years. This was an ongoing oppression that started in 1929, where peasants were having their rights stripped away. And something she mentioned made me think of these own islands, our own islands here. She talked about the grain being grown but been taken away, been shipped where the peasants couldn't get to it. And in this part of the world, we have suffered from famine as well. Again, a man-made famine where nature had a part to play, because in the 1840s, across the north of Europe, there was a potato blight which affected the Highlands of Scotland, but more brutally affected Ireland, particular areas like Donegal and West Cork. And during this time, where the potatoes, the crop that they relied on, was being ravaged by the blight, there were crops being grown and taken away, shipped to other parts of Britain. So even in our own islands, we have some experience of that. The member for Ealing North talked about famine and genocide and mentioned a number of famines across the world that we have to consider. But he described Ukraine as being the breadbasket of Europe. And again, this point, there was no shortage of grain. The famine was caused by oppression. It was about crushing of the people. It was about attacking the peasants. And he also mentioned the faith community, who were particularly targeted during this time. He also said that Ukraine was more than just a borderland, that it was a nation in its own right. And that's something that, of course, myself and people in my party would recognise and respect. The point he made about no genocide before 1948 is quite important. We do recognise that there have been other genocides taking place, and it is only right that this one is put in the same grouping. If I could say a few words on behalf of Scotland here, the Scottish Parliament notes the Day of Remembrance of the Holodomor, and we will recognise this year on the 25th of November. But we also recognise that this was an entirely avoidable tragedy, and that this deliberate act of genocide was committed by the Stalin regime on the people of Ukraine. And I'm completely in agreement with the Honourable Member for Mid-Derbyshire and for the Member for Ealing North that this must be recognised by the UK Government, as has been done by other European governments. This recognition is important, not just for people who want to know more and find out more about their own history, but it's also important for the relatives of the victims of the Holodomor, including the Ukrainian community now living in Scotland. Absolutely.
I really don't want to interrupt the Honourable Lady's flow, because she's speaking well and powerfully and passionately. She always does. But I actually sometimes despair of the way in which we tie ourselves in knots. Barack Obama used to refer to the Armenian genocide as the Medzheghem, which in Armenian simply means great crime, or yeah, that would be the direct translation of it. And it seems to me that we go round and round the houses coming out with these different expressions. Surely genocide is the murder of a race. Genus and sede. This is perfectly simple. Can we simply not decide once and for all, let's stop the obfuscation, let's stop the nonsense, let's stop trying to justify things with different names. Genocide is genocide. And until we call it that, we cannot be justified in addressing it and attacking it, and most importantly, preventing it.
Absolutely, and this recognition, when we look at the work that's been done by many campaigners who want to raise awareness of the Holodomor, this recognition is so important. If we are to avoid making the same mistakes again, it is important that we do recognise this. So I'll just finish by saying that that the present-day political situation in Ukraine remains tense, and the Scottish Government continues to extend its position of support and solidarity with the people of Ukraine. And we look forward to a time when tensions in the Ukraine are significantly eased and that dialogue is used rather than oppression. But I will reiterate the words of my colleagues here. We must recognise this as genocide. We must call it out as this, and we must make sure that history is not repeated.
Khaled Mahmood.
Thank you, sir. It's a pleasure and a privilege to serve under your chairmanship. And may I start with paying a tribute to the Honourable Member for Mid-Derbyshire for securing this very important and passionate debate, and where, as it's already been expressed, a huge amount of concern raises about this. In doing so, she has helped raise awareness of an issue which is generally under-discussed in this country, including within Parliament. For that, I congratulate her for bringing that awareness to us. And she has also given us a timely reminder of why our commitment to helping resolve ongoing ethnic tensions in Ukraine remains important. To begin with, it is absolutely right that we should recognise the famine of the 1930s for a humanitarian catastrophe that it so clearly was. As the writer Anne Applebaum documents in her recent book, Red Famine, roughly 13% of the Ukraine entire population are likely to have been wiped out in the famine. Even today, the full extent of the death toll may never be known, in part because of the inevitable difficulties involved in determining whether deaths were caused directly by famine or by the widespread malnutrition and disease inevitably that came with it. Whether or not the famine came out because of the deliberate policies of the Stalin regime, what is surely undeniable is that it was a man-made disaster which could and should have been avoided. In Anne Applebaum's book, reminds us the highly emotive and sensitive questions of whether this episode amounts to a genocide against the Ukrainian people remains unresolved. The opposition shares the government's view that definition of genocide is necessarily a matter of law. And I know today that all three members have raised this issue with a great amount of passion, and the substance of their debate here has been to recognise that. I think that matter has to be tested in a court of law in order for us to be able to move forward and to deal with this very, very substantive issue. Until that is done, it is difficult, I think, for Parliament just to do that. Whether the government wants to move to doing that, that will be an issue for us to see in the future. So the question of whether the precise legal threshold for a classification of genocide has been met in any particular case must be left for the courts to decide. That said, we must try to avoid becoming so preoccupied with those legal questions that we risk losing the sight of the very real consequences of this tragedy for Ukrainians of the time and today. Entrenched divisions in the region, most predominantly by no means exclusively between the ethnic Russians and Ukrainians, continue to both drive the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine and to hamper the efforts to resolve it. We should remember that within Ukraine itself, debates over the questions like whether the 1930 famine constitutes a genocide often play out as debates pitting the ethnic Ukrainian majority against the Russian-speaking minority, who have often felt marginalized by Kyiv. We should also remember that more than any other factor, it is Russian government's outrageous, reckless and irresponsible efforts to fan the flames of those grievances, particularly by continuing to promote separatist sentiment in the Russian-speaking eastern region, which continues to prolong devastating conflict so far, which company that has so far claimed over 10,000 lives. We must remember the tragic efforts of the Ukraine. The past, we must therefore resolve that. We must also redouble our efforts to helping resolve the challenge of the present. In this regard, we must first and foremost refocus attention on the peaceful resolution to the conflicts, both in eastern Ukraine and in Crimea under Russian occupation. It is disappointing that under the government's it is disappointing that under this government, the UK has largely been an observer to the diplomatic process led by France and Germany, rather than an active participant. Can the Minister therefore tell us what specific steps is the government now taking to support that process, and what plans he has to secure a more active participation by the UK in efforts amid resolving this crisis peacefully? The second, as the government sanctions bill moves through Parliament, what guarantees can the Minister give that when we leave the EU, there will be no attempt to revoke or otherwise water down sanctions we have in place against Russia with regard to its actions in Ukraine, and specifically that those sanctions will remain in place until Minsk agreements have been implemented in full? Finally, given that we are leaving the UK, it is important to remember that how valuable and the ability to coordinate on a foreign policy with the efforts of the European partners has been, both for the UK and for the rest of the EU. This is particularly the case in regarding to Ukraine. From coordinating sanctions between the 28 EU member states to providing trade and other incentives for the political reforms which the government of Ukraine must continue to pursue. Securing the formal set of arrangements on continuing that close cooperation when we leave should be securing formal set of arrangements on continuing that close cooperation when we leave should be one of the government's top priorities. But as far as I can tell, no plans have been made, and that there is no progress on this issue in the negotiations either. If I'm wrong, I would be very happy for the Minister to correct that. But we need more than just warm words from the government. We need an actual plan, a detailed, credible one, for securing a framework for the foreign policy and the cooperation that is so vital in sustaining British influence in places like Ukraine. 75 years from the devastating famine, the country once again finds itself in a crisis. And so we must commemorate the events of the past and give them their due recognition. So we must also bring our renewed commitment to healing the divides that are very much with us today. I look forward to hearing from the Minister about how the government intends to do that.
Mrs. Latham that she will get 2 minutes once the Minister sits down. Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Walker, and in common with colleagues, it's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and a pleasure to be here. Like the honourable gentleman for Ealing North, my thanks to the honourable lady, my honourable friend, the member for Mid Derbyshire, for moving the debate today is not just a matter of routine. She spoke eloquently with emotion and passion about the difficulty of the events that we're describing today. And it's one of those speeches, just like the honourable gentleman's, that you wish there were rather more people around to hear. But I've no doubt through the miracles of modern science that more people will get the opportunity to hear the speeches, and I congratulate colleagues for what they have said. To start with an apology on behalf of my right honourable friend, the Minister for Europe and the Americas, whose portfolio interest, of course, the Ukraine is, but he's travelling on ministerial duties, and therefore he would have been pleased to answer the debate, but it falls to me to do so. My honourable friend's powerful opening speech and the contribution of other honourable members have brought home the immense suffering and brutality of the Ukrainian Holodomor. I remember my own contact with the Ukrainian community in North Manchester very well. My wife and I visited Smedley Lane a number of times to the community centre. We went one year to decorate the eggs beautifully around about Easter time. My children, who are now 30 and 32, I think still have them somewhere in a corner of the bedroom, and to watch the beautiful dancing and everything, and enjoyed the Ukrainian community in Bury and North Manchester very well. And it's nice to have an opportunity to pay tribute to their courtesy and friendliness towards one of their local MPs, and thank them for all that. The Honourable Gentleman Member for Ealing North spoke as fluently as he always does. He puts us all to shame. There's never a note in sight, at least, and he speaks with these matters with a fluency which is clearly based on deep general knowledge of the situation and understanding. He represents his community very well, and having travelled with him to former Eastern Europe with the IPU, I know that these passions are very deep. And he spoke with immense clarity in both the Armenian issue and in relation to the Ukraine and other issues, and makes a very powerful speech. His kindness towards me is appreciated, particularly when, as I'm sure he knows, I'm unable to agree with the conclusion and move the government's position. But I do appreciate how he put it. The Honourable Lady who spoke for the SNP drew attention to another part of British history, which has echoes here, whether it's the Irish famine or the Highland clearances. My own ancestors are buried in a common grave on Culloden Field, the Robertsons, and the story of the Highland clearances and the work of John Preble and what he wrote about has influenced many of us in trying to understand a bit more about elements of rather forgotten British history. And when you're a Scot brought up in England, you don't hear a lot about Scottish history. And it's history and memory, Mr. Walker, that's at the heart of this. Not so much a legal definition, which is important. Definitions matter. Names and what you call things matter. But memory probably matters more. And how we're able as communities to remember what happened in the past, whether or not a particular label is put on them, but to recognise an atrocity for what it is, and to, through that, somehow find a way to recognise that a community which survives something like that and develops a tightness of relationship and commemorates, whether it's through poetry, whether it's through song, whether it's through dance, whether it's through a community, particularly when they move abroad, spending time with each other, keeping their language going, keeping their affection for the region going, as well as those who live there. All this is highly pertinent. And it means, although this is a debate which has to focus on the legal definition, as the United Kingdom sees it, of genocide, the fact that the United Kingdom cannot move its position, as I'll explain, in no way detracts from the understanding of memory that speeches here have been based upon. The Honourable Lady quoted a poem movingly at the end, but there are more. There are more to understand. I'm just searching for my note. Through the eyes of a child by Halia Dimitrician, who describes in the poem how Ukraine moves from a land of song and plenty, where the soil is enriched with minerals, and describes all the food that's available, and then moves to odds, death and famine stalking the land like ravaging wolves. In a way, this language almost does more than a legal type definition of genocide. However, let me return after those general remarks, if I may, to the issue before us and what my honourable friend has brought forward. She certainly made clear the immense suffering and brutality of the Ukrainian Holodomor. This was a devastating chapter in history, in Soviet history and Ukrainian history. My honourable friend and those in her constituency, as does the Ukrainian community throughout the country, deserve great credit for keeping the memory of it alive. In doing so, they not only honour the victims, they strengthen our resolve to ensure that such horrors never happen again. The famine that reached its darkest depths during 1932 and 33 was a tragedy of such magnitude it's difficult to comprehend. 85 years later, it remains a shocking reminder of the deadly consequences of the policies and political goals of the Soviet Union, as the honourable gentleman, the member for Ealing North, made clear. It's hard to comprehend how such an event would be covered today, when we would be able to see because of modern communications, much more of what happened and whether that would have had any impact upon it. There's still some debate about the exact number of people who died during the Holodomor and to what extent Stalin and his government set out systematically to destroy Ukraine alone. However, what's not in question is that the famine caused appalling suffering, and the responsibility for it lay squarely with the leaders of the Soviet Union. My honourable friend has called on the government to recognise the Holodomor as a genocide. I can understand the basis for my honourable friend's request. I remember dealing with the debate in this room in relation to the Kurdish community and what happened to them under Saddam Hussein when they were pursuing exactly the same ends, and how difficult it was to respond and to be able to say, as the honourable gentleman, the member for Perry Barr, speaking on behalf of the opposition, said, there are certain legal requirements that the British government has successively believed we have to follow. It was hard to respond and to not recognise it legally, as people would wish us to do. However, there are, we believe, very sound reasons to desist from doing so. These are essentially criminal matters on which we believe appropriate courts are best placed to make a judgment, taking into account all of the relevant evidence. The Honourable Lady asked me particularly about UK direction and direction towards UK courts. It's not necessary for UK courts to decide. It can be decided by any court anywhere as a legal definition. The approach has guided successive UK governments in relation to other atrocities. The decisions to recognise as genocides the Holocaust, the 1994 killings in Rwanda, the 1995 massacre in Srebrenica, only came about following judgments by appropriate courts in line with the definitions set out in international law. And having been to both Rwanda and to Srebrenica and seen the after effects and spoken to people, I'm aware that the definition does matter, but the definition was found to be appropriate in those circumstances and used. Yes, of course.
Early on in his peroration, he referred to the contribution the Ukrainian people have made to this country. And, of course, we know the huge contribution they made in coal mining, in steel. You look at the huge Ukrainian community in Sheffield. There are many people of Ukrainian origin. We've even had one member of parliament here, Zimon Danchuk, who's no longer in the House, who was of Ukrainian origin. Many Ukrainian people will be listening to him today. Would the honourable gentleman agree that if the Holodomor took place today, there would absolutely be no doubt whatsoever that it should not be called genocide? Would he agree that if it happened today, it would be called genocide?
Minister. It's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that, in that, as I say, the Kurdish community regard what happened to them under Saddam Hussein and the chemical warfare inflicted upon their people. That happened within relatively recent times. And again, because most countries, not all, but most countries have recognised that it's a legal definition rather than a political act, I'm not necessarily certain. I would hope, however, that the response of the world would be as such as not to allow something of that magnitude to take place. But as I've just spent the last couple of hours dealing with events in the Middle East, from Yemen through to the activities of Daesh in Iraq and all that sort of thing, it would be nice to say we live in a world where never again means never again. I don't think we do, actually, for a moment. And I'm not sure what the definition would be. However, that the world might be able to act to stop it, and that there would be action taken against the perpetrators in a manner now which is possible, which was possible after Srebrenica, to take people to the court, the work of the International Commission on Missing Persons and the work they did in identifying those who had died, and by doing so be able to demonstrate that where they died led to the identification of those who had killed them, and therefore justice could be done. That's certainly something that I think would probably happen in the modern day. But that the world recognises the atrocity for what it was is the purpose of our debate today, and those who keep it alive and those who ensure that it is remembered, whatever dates may be most appropriate. So I will, but I'm coming to a conclusion. My honourable lady will have the chance to speak, but if she wants to ask me a further question, of course.
Right Honourable Gentleman mentioned Rwanda. That was never known as a genocide when it was happening, but the population were talking about a genocide, and it was only afterwards. Why, could he perhaps answer why the world does not want to recognise genocides when it's happening. We're seeing the Rohingya crisis at the moment, and there have been continuous genocides happening, but the world doesn't want to recognise it until it's over, which is too late to do anything about it.
I don't honestly believe it's too late to do anything about them. I think the definition and the designation of events, whether it happens at the time or whether it happens afterwards, does not prevent the governments of the world taking appropriate action to deal with those events that are happening. And certainly the fact that since 1948 it's been possible to designate events to strengthen the hand of the international community if it wants to take action in those cases is important. But it remains the case that Rwanda was dealt with as Srebrenica was by a legal definition, and that's what the United Kingdom still depends on dealing with those events that are more contemporary. But that these events happened some 85 years ago still makes no difference to the depth of the pain and the suffering endured and to the horrors that she rightly described. So I'm afraid the government remains convinced that recognition decisions should be based on credible judicial processes, as the front bench opposite also agree with. And our stance on the Holodomor will continue to follow this approach. However, the Honourable Gentleman Member for Perry-Barr offered me a couple of specific questions which I'd like to respond to. Firstly, in terms of our engagement on the Ukraine issue, the UK stands shoulder to shoulder with the Ukrainian people and upholding Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We remain committed to providing political and practical support to Ukraine over the long term. The UK has been at the forefront of international efforts to hold Russia to account for its aggression in UK, in the EU, in NATO, in the G7, in the OSCE and the UN. We'll continue to do so. We remain clear that sanctions are linked to the full implementation of the Minsk agreements and the end of Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. We'll continue to push for this commitment to be upheld. And we believe that sanctions should continue until the Minsk agreements are fully implemented. I've not seen any suggestion that that should be changed in any way by our leaving the EU. And as I think members who are present in the House will know, my own personal view is that, of course, the political relationships with the EU should be as close as possible. The United Kingdom has benefited enormously politically from the relationships we've had throughout the EU in dealing with common crises in a common and united way. It's one of the more unfortunate consequences of the people's decision to leave the European Union that is called into question. I don't think there's any necessity why it should be. Clearly, it's in the United Kingdom's interests following March 2019 to ensure that the political relationships remain very close, and ministers in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office are particularly concerned to make sure that the sort of relationships which you could have on the margins of the main council meetings of ministers, at which we won't be present in the future, we find alternative ways to make sure that that work is continued. So, although I recognise the question and it's perfectly fair to put, my sense is that both in DFID and the FCO, both of which I represent, there is a determination to make sure that those close relationships with our friends and our partners in the European Union are not broken in any way by our decision to take a different path to the future in which they will be partners but in a slightly different manner. May I conclude before asking the Honourable Lady to speak again, that our approach in relation to the legal definition should in no way diminish the importance or the enormity of the Ukrainian Holodomor and what the government thinks about it, and neither does it diminish the horror we feel about it. It remains vital we remember such tragedies, that we reflect upon them, Mr Walker, and we recommit to work to ensure they don't happen again. The importance of this cannot be overstated. In the 85 years since the beginning of the Holodomor, countless people, both inside and outside Ukraine, have fought to keep alive the memory of those millions who died, and we pay tribute as a government to their efforts. This chapter in Europe's history is too important to be forgotten. And it's vital that it's commemorated so that lessons can be learned for generations to come. And we're indebted to the speeches of all the colleagues who've taken part in the debate this afternoon to do just that.
To say the least, I am disappointed. And I'm sure the Minister recognises that I'm disappointed that we will not recognise the Holodomor as a genocide. We've recognised the Holocaust as a genocide retrospectively, so surely we should be recognising this as a genocide retrospectively with the wealth of evidence that is out there. And I hope that he will refer to the Right Honourable Minister, who is unable to be with us today, my thoughts. I'm really very disappointed. I can't express how disappointed I am that this second debate I brought into the House and we haven't moved anywhere. But I'm also slightly disappointed that the Right Honourable Member did not answer my 4 questions. Perhaps he or his department would write to me about how the Ukrainian people can progress this, to which courts and the best route forward. Maybe he could write to me and give me that guidance. I would also like to thank the Honourable Member for Ely North, for Glasgow North West and for Perry Barr for participating in this debate, because the more people that speak about it, the wider the awareness will be by people in this country, and they will recognise it. And I would finally just like to recommend, there are lots of books written about this genocide. I would like to recommend the latest one, the one by Anne Applebaum, The Red Famine. You've only got to look at the photographs of the people in that, or any photographs from that period, to recognise that these people starved to death. And that is something that we must never forget. So I'd like to thank the Minister very much for coming and answering. I'm delighted he was able to. I know it was a bit of a push. And to thank other members, including actually the member for Strangford, who had to rush to catch a plane home. But thank you all very much for participating, and we must not forget this in the future.
I'd like to thank the Minister for indicating to the Chair that he will be writing to the Honourable Lady. The question is that this House has considered the Ukrainian Holodomor. As many of that opinion say aye, of the contrary no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Order, order. Sitting suspended until 4 p.m.